tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't even have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So, snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, casually as he could, their son, he'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept into the bedroom window and peered down to the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Pivot Drive as though it were waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought of them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no signs of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Pivot Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed on the next street, nor when the two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner. The cat had been watching, appeared so suddenly and silently you'd have thought he had just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Pivot Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and his beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were so light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. The man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived on a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he didn't seem to realize that he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for inside his pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer until the only lights left on the whole street were two tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out their window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put outer back inside his cloak and set off down the street toward number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall. I hope that's right. Brendan's going to be laughing in the other room if I don't know how to say these names. He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses, exactly the shape of the markings the cat had around its eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said the professor. "All day? When could you have been celebrating? I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." The professor sniffed angrily. "Oh, yes, everyone's celebrating all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a bit more careful. But no, even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' dark living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent? I bet that was Daedalus Dingle. He never had much sense." "You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We've had previous little to celebrate for 11 years. "I know that," said the professor irritably, "but there is no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless, out on the streets in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumors." She threw a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he was going to tell her something. But he didn't, so she went on. "A fine thing would be if, on the very day you-know-who seems to have disappeared at last, the Muggles found out about us all. I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore?" "It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a lemon drop?" "A what?" "A lemon drop. They're a kind of sweet, Muggle sweet I'm rather fond of." "No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for lemon drops. "As I say, even if you-know-who has gone, my dear Professor, surely a sensible person like you can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense for 11 years, I have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort." The professor flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 lemon drops, seemed not to notice. "It gets all confusing if we keep saying you-know-who. I have never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name." "I know you haven't," said the professor, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. "But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only all right Voldemort was frightened of." "You flatter me," said Dumbledore calmly. "Voldemort had powers that I will never have." "Only because you're too, well, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed this much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs." The professor shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "The owls are nothing next to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying? About why he disappeared? About what finally stopped him?" It seemed that the professor had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss, the real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day. For neither as a cat nor a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe until Dumbledore told her it